Thank you for the invitation. And yes, I have already heard from the previous speaker referring to eFTI, being ready for eFTI, implementing eFTI. So maybe I assume that not all present in the audience today know what the eFTI regulation is about. So I will try to give you a brief introduction. eFTI is indeed trying to respond to some of the issues that have been highlighted by the previous speaker when it comes to the acceptance of electronic documents by the authorities to prove compliance with applicable rules for transport. So we're aiming to contribute to rendering transport paperless, both by targeting the documents and information that concern the movement of the goods, and we'll see later on how that could be integrated with systems that also support the exchange of data in an electronic format on vehicles and drivers, for example, certificates as well. We also, with the eFTI regulation, we're also aiming to help improve overall visibility across the supply chain, because even though it is a regulation that specifically targets the exchange of information between the economic operators and the authorities, leaving outside the business-to-business exchange, we hope that by through the standards of information exchange that we'll be setting with the eFTI regulation, we will be also facilitating the business-to-business real-time exchange of information on the goods, and we also target think a complementarity with other EU systems that are already in place in a business to authority environment that is for customs, but also for the maritime single window. So that's to allow the economic operators to indeed remove the need to have paper or use paper for any purposes, but also to need to use too many systems to present the same information to the authorities. The regulation is also part of the wider EU commitments to make transport more sustainable, smart and resilient, also through digitalization. So eFTI, while it is a major EU policy initiative, it is not the only one. So we hope that together we will eventually render transport fully paperless, but also very smart and sustainable. What are the main requirements of the eFTI regulation? First of all, the regulation establishes a firm obligation on the authorities in all the EU member states to accept information electronically when this is presented to prove compliance with applicable EU and national rules on the movement of the goods. The only requirement to the economic operators for this obligation of the authorities to be triggered is that they use a standard information exchange for that purpose, which is actually what you hear a lot, the eFTI platforms. So the economic operators are required to use eFTI platforms to make the information available to the authorities. That would be the requirement. They are not obliged, but to use the eFTI platforms, but they could still use paper. But if they want to have or other electronic means, but obviously if they want to have the guarantee that the authorities will accept the data in electronic format, that needs to be made available via the eFTI platforms. The regulation also sets the main requirements to be met by the eFTI platforms, but also by the service providers that would use these eFTI platforms. And these requirements very much look into ensuring that the data is kept secure, but also there is a traceability of who made what changes on the data in order to ensure its originality. And there are also requirements when it comes to the access to the data, that the data both by the authorities but also by the economic operators, is accessed in a manner that allows for full identification, authentication, but also on the basis of authorization, proper authorization in corresponding to their rights. Like for the authorities, for example, would imply that they could see only the data related to the information requirements which are coming from the legislation that they are responsible to enforce. So a law enforcement officer on road cannot see a data that is on on the same FTI platform as the data kept for the transport that he is currently or at the moment checking. So he cannot access data on a movement by the same company on rail when it is kept on the same FTI platform. So that for example is also intended to be avoided through the requirements of the regulation. And in order to make sure that the FTI platforms comply with these requirements, but also the service providers, there are also obligations for them to make data available, kept it secure, etc. There is also a requirement for certification. And this certification is what we call it a one-stop shop, namely it can be received from one certification organization that's accredited in one of the EU member states, and then this certification is recognized all over the EU. Just maybe to underscore, the information that we're looking at is information that is already required by EU and national legislation in place, and it covers not only road but also rail, inland waterways and aviation. We're also looking at dangerous goods in these transport modes, and also we're looking at waste shipments as well. The next slide shows, the vision in practice. The bottom layer showing the exchange between the actors, and the higher one also how that would also work in the background, the machine-to-machine exchange. The idea is that economic operators can store data, keep the data on the transport operations on FTI platforms of their choice. They can be multiple. They can be part of these own systems of the economic operators, or they can be part of the platforms of IT service providers that provide wider services for data exchange between the businesses. And then that data can be exchanged with all the actors in the logistics chain, only with the requirement that it is accompanied by a unique identification link or a unique identifier to allow the unique identification of the data corresponding to a transport operation. And on that basis, then the other actors in the chain can also add or modify data that is related to the transport corresponding to their own needs, but also rights to do so when it comes to the change of data. And then when an inspection officer requires this data to check compliance with the rules, the economic operators would need to, in principle, provide only a machine-readable unique identifier of the data, which the authorities are then required to be able to read it through their own devices, through their own systems, and to retrieve the data directly from the FTI platforms. Obviously, again, with all the required identification, authentication, and authorization provisions in place. But that's how that should work. There's also fail-safe provision, which requires that in case the whole machine-to-machine information exchange cannot take place, the operators have on board the vehicles a human-readable format of the data, so that the officers can also see it as a document in case they cannot retrieve it directly themselves from the FTI platforms. And this is, I understand this is what the Gigino project and other pilots are trying to set up in place, how that would work in practice, because the regulation just sets out the main requirements, but we are yet to define how that should actually work in practice. And this is something that we need to adopt via additional EU acts, which are secondary legislations, delegated and implementing acts. I wanted to highlight the relationship with the DCMR, but not only, but also with other transport documents or transport contracts, which are also governed by other international conventions on other transport modes. What is important to remember is that the FT regulation does not cover the ECMR, the implementation of the ECMR, CMR Convention and the ECMR Protocol as such, but actually the information that is covered by the FT regulation is identical in 90 to 95% to that which is required in the CMR. Actually, some national legislation even directly refer to the CMR as all the information in CMR to be presented to the authorities. So as such, we'll be covering the electronic use of the CMR as well. And we're providing, as I mentioned, all the implementation specifications for the validity of the electronic document when used to prove compliance to the authorities for the different legislation applicable. FT regulation does not cover that use of the CMR or other transport contract as a contract between the parties. So it's not as such a guarantee that it would fully be accepted by the courts, but because it's not in the legislation and regulation as such. But we do count that actually the courts will conclude that if an ECMR that is kept on the FT platforms in accordance with the requirements of the FT regulation, if that is good enough as valid to prove compliance with the legislation in force, and it would good enough as proof of the contract between the parties, so it could also be used and recognized in court. I would also like to highlight something else that the FT regulation doesn't do. It doesn't cover the customs formalities, nor the maritime transport formalities. It only covers that the transport within the EU hinterland, as I said, by rail, road, inland waterways, and air. But it is agnostic of the origin and destination of the transport. So it could be transports that originate outside the EU and end in the EU, or the other way around, they start in the EU and outside the EU, or purely transit. But whenever these transport operations are subject to EU legislation or national legislation, then the FT regulation applies. And we are trying to ensure interoperability with these systems at the level of the data to make sure that transport data that needs to be provided to customs or to maritime single windows basically can be reused directly from the FT platforms. My next slide, I saw that time is ticking. This is the implementation timeline. So we're looking indeed, there was mentioned the August 2024, that's the date from which actually the FT platforms and the service providers will start applying for the certification, and then they can start using it fully, with the full guarantee that the authorities are obliged to accept as of August 2025, because that's the start date of the obligation of the member states to accept. And in the meantime, we have a few deadlines to adopt the implementation specifications. That's February 2023 for the member states' IT systems requirements, so technical and functional specifications. August 2023, functional technical requirements for the FT platforms and service providers. And then we also have in 2024 the rules for the certification. So that's what we are now working towards, and that's where also different pilots and projects like Digino are helpful, because they are helping us to better define these implementation specifications that actually serve practical purpose, but also take into account systems that are already out there. So they're already testing how the FT regulation works in practice, and we'll try to take that into account when defining these implementation specifications through the legislation. And I believe that would be mostly the core of what I wanted to highlight to you, just to say that this is part of the process of defining these implementation specifications. We're working with experts from the industry in the Digital Transport and Logistics Forum that will provide recommendations to us, and that's also where we're taking and we're listening to and trying to incorporate lessons learned and recommendations from the pilots and projects. And then we'll be working with the member states experts in two separate dedicated groups, depending on the type of legislation that we need to adopt. But there are member states experts that will need to be consulted on the delegated acts, and they will need to vote on the implementing act. And the difference is the delegated acts would cover the language that the systems will need to talk, both the FT platforms and the authorities ones, so the FT data set, as well as the rules for certification, whereas the implementing act, where there is a vote, they will cover the functional technical specifications for the systems, for the authorities, and for the FT platforms. We expect many benefits, particularly in terms of administrative savings, cost savings, but also benefits for the enforcement authorities in terms of more efficient enforcement. Also some greening effects as well, thanks to smoother logistics, but also paper savings. While the costs they are there as well, we estimate, but they would be very much compensated by the future benefits, particularly for the economic first line, as you see there. And that is it for me. We also have a nice video if you would like to watch it. That's the first one. And the second video that also showcases the wider work of the Digital Transport and Logistics Forum that tries to cover also the business-to-business exchanges and to ensure that takes place in a smooth, interoperable way between different systems with using different standards. And where also we want FT platforms to fit as well in the wider concept of this federated network of platforms that they are developing. So thank you for invitation and for listening to this presentation.